to another episode of Hair Bear Short Stories. And if you found your way to my cozy little corner of the internet, and you like a story or two, sit back and relax. Have a listen, have a laugh, take your shoes off, and set a spell. So I've got one more full chapter written. Chapter 10 is proving to be difficult for me to write. We're kind of in somewhat of a bridge section until the finale, as it were. So today we have Chapter 9 of Whole, A Friend in Need. The legend of the Sandman has its origins in the gritty material we sometimes have in our eyes when we wake up in the morning. The story, dating back to before written history, is that the Sandman sprinkles his sand in your eyes to send you off to sleep. Whether you subscribe to the version where he is a kindly anthropomorphic personification of restorative rest, or a creepy old gnome who then steals your eyes and takes them to his iron nest in the moon to feed to his children, is really a matter of your outlook on life. The truth is, of course, that the room in our eyes in the morning is a buildup of dust, skin cells and such that have been flushed from our unblinking eyes in the night and left there when the tears have dried. There are the mornings, however, when the grit in your eyes is due to the fact that you are face down in a vineyard. Ben rolled over and groaned. His head throbbed and his body was one massive ache. He could see why he had mistaken this for a hangover last time. Yep, it had happened again. It was different this time, though. Before was a complete blackout, like when he was a kid. No warning, no transition from one state to the other, just the events in his memory simply hitting a blank wall until he came to. This time, though, he could feel it coming. More than that, there was almost a sense of a request. As though whatever took him over during these episodes was calmly tapping him on the shoulder, saying, "Look, you seem to be a bit over your head at the moment. Let me drive for a minute or we're both screwed." There was no mistaking the edge to the request, like a roommate politely asking to use your car for a serious emergency. If you say no, he'd kick you in the dick, take your keys and burn out on the lawn, so Ben knew that despite this new consideration of his alter ego, he didn't have much of a choice on how events were to unfold. The thing was, Ben did make the choice. He made the decision to hand over the keys because he knew full well how the night would otherwise end. He also knew that it would likely mean a brutal end for his captors, but they had pulled him off the street, beat the hell out of him, and were about to move on to Cuddy things, so screw them. Indeed, the conscious decision to hand over the control seemed to bring with it enough clarity to preserve some flashes of memory. Screams, blood, fire. That was certainly a side effect he could do without, but the deliberate handing over of control was paradoxically empowering and completely changed the landscape. Speaking of landscape, where the hell was he? He sat up. Ben knew every inch of his vineyard and could tell without turning around, fortunately, since the flexibility for such a maneuver currently eluded him, that his house was about 100 yards directly behind him. He had gotten home all right anyway. How had he done that without his bike? He looked down at his feet and the state of his shoes to find the parts of them that were not peeled back from his feet like a banana were practically melted off. It looked as though, until he could get himself another pair of sneakers, he'd be wearing his work boots for the interim. Oh shit, he thought. Work? What time is it? The bare patch on his left wrist where his watch had once been told him nothing useful, except he needed a new one. Based on the sun, though, it wasn't quite mid-morning. At least he hadn't missed any of his shift for today. He was going to have to figure out how to beg off work for the rest of the day, though, because even the strange and violent occurrences of the previous night hadn't made him forget that Steve was coming. For anyone else, he would have just canceled, but not for his brother. Besides, if the past was anything to judge by, his abductors were surely dead. Likewise, based on his flashes of memory, the place was most likely burned to the ground as well, so what could he even do about it? Turn himself in? That was a non-starter if he ever heard one. Yes, officer, I was kidnapped, chained up, and beaten by 3 roided-out meth heads, and I single-handedly escaped, beat them to death, and burned down the shop. He barely believed it himself. No, best to carry on as normal, which meant it was time to put on his ass-kissing voice and try to wrangle an evening off. He also needed to get a handle on this thing if he was going to survive. He was going to have to talk it through with someone trustworthy, with an open mind. Ronnie hung up the phone, grabbed her keys, and shouted to her sister that she was going out seconds before the tasting room door closed behind her. Carol would be mad at her later, but she could handle the place herself for the afternoon, and they closed Monday evenings anyway. Besides, it was clear Ben needed her. The flat tone in his voice scared her even more than the wound she treated for him yesterday, especially since the reason he was asking her to come over was because he didn't want to tell her what he had to say over the phone. Any other time, this would have simply piqued her curiosity. She loved mystery and intrigue, but this situation was making her teeth itch. Travel time from Chan's to Ben's place was around 15 minutes, but given the time of day, the fact that it was too early in the year for local police to be in quota mode, and Ronnie being heavily motivated, she made it in just under 8. She burst through the door, ready for anything, except the sight of Ben sitting at his table, trying to duct tape together a pair of shoes that looked like they'd been stuffed with firecrackers. Ben looked up and said, "Wow, that was fast." Ronnie stepped forward and took Ben's chin in her hand, turning his head from side to side. "You don't look like you got beat up again. In fact, the cuts on your face look like they're almost gone already. How's that possible? If you didn't get into another fight, what happened? Why couldn't you tell me over the phone? What the hell happened to your shoes?" Ben chuckled and pulled his chin back out of her hand. "I guess they are pretty much shot," he said, tossing the one in his hand over his shoulder. "I'll tell you what happened when you slow down for a minute. You might want to have a seat." He gestured toward the other wobbly chair by the table. Ronnie sat, but not before giving him another shrewd look. After 20 minutes or so, Ben had summarized the events of the previous night as best he could, and Ronnie's mouth was hanging open in absolute befuddlement. "So, let me get this straight," she said. "You have a history of blackouts when you were a kid, but it started happening to you again recently, and when it does, people turn up dead? In a nutshell, I guess, but only twice, and when my life was in danger. It's not like I'm on a rampage," Ben said, wincing as the wording of her situation hit him. Ronnie felt bad because, after all, this was Ben they were talking about, but she wasn't one to gloss over rough facts. He was right, though. It was only happening in extreme situations that seemed to be happening around him more often lately. Still, as he said, it was only twice, and 2 points of data only make a line, not a pattern. There was the other aspect that piqued her interest as well. "You said the blackout last night was different, though, as though you made the decision yourself?" "Yeah," Ben said, frowning. "Not like I was deciding to pass out, but more like I was handing over control." Ronnie raised an eyebrow. "Jesus take the wheel?" "Someone showed up, but it sure as hell wasn't Jesus," Ben replied. "And they didn't take the wheel so much as grab the wheel, stomp on the gas, and run over whoever was in the way." He grimaced. "Do you think I'm going crazy? A psychopath or schizo or something?" "No," Ronnie said pensively. Something about this was tickling her memory. "Psychopaths are very aware of what they're doing. They just don't care. And schizophrenics hear voices and see things that aren't there. This sounds more like..." There was a sudden knocking at the door. Ben and Ronnie locked gazes, and his pale face told her they were thinking the exact same thing. There was still one more brother. Ben shook his head and stood. "They haven't bothered to knock so far." Ronnie was about to tell him that from what she knew of the oldest Lionel brother, knocking on the door before he killed you was exactly the type of thing he would do, but Ben was already across the small room and opening the door. A dark figure stood outside, built of whipcord muscle with a killer's glint in his eye. He was holding a bicycle in front of him. "Hey, Gato," Ben said, "you found my bike." Ronnie's heartbeat slowed down from the dangerous level it had spiked to. This was the vineyard foreman Ben had been with on the first night. Ben had talked about him often, though she and Gato had never met. This was the guy he had strolled off into the fields with to learn how to work the vineyards. Ben either had no survival instinct or was ballsier than she had given him credit for. Either way, having an eyewitness perspective of one of Ben's blackouts, who had actually survived the experience, could answer a few questions she had. She stood from her chair and faced the door. "Que onda, Toro?" Gato was saying. Then he noticed Ronnie standing behind Ben. "I am interrupting?" he asked. His wolfish demeanor seemed incongruently sheepish. No, you're good, Gato. This is Ronnie. She and her sister run Chance Vineyards. Gato's eyes lit up as Ronnie stepped forward and offered her hand. Hi, Gato. I've heard a lot about you. Ah, si, Gato said, shaking her hand with a strong, calloused grip. I know your wine. Muy bien. Thank you, Ronnie said. Did you just call Ben Toro? She cocked an eyebrow Benwards. Ben flushed slightly. Long story. Where did you find my bike, Gato? Gato released Ronnie's hand and turned back to Ben, his face suddenly unreadable. Guillermo, found by the road. He think it looks like yours, and I think so also. I worry that... He cut himself off sharply with a pointed glance at Ronnie. Ah, Ben nodded. About that, you'd better come in for a bit. Gato glanced once more at Ronnie, then nodded. He leaned the bike against the wall outside and came in. Having only the 2 chairs, Ben sat on his bed while his guests sat in them. Ronnie's initial read of Gato did not seem any less valid, but he sat perched on the edge of his chair, which he had placed closer to the door before sitting, ready to flee at the first loud noise. This man had seen some shit. Ben bustled about the small kitchenette, making coffee, and handed them each a cup. Ronnie and Gato both took theirs gratefully. Somehow, in times of stress and uncertainty, holding a warm cup of something was soothing to the nerves, even if you didn't drink it. As soon as they were settled, Ben summarized the previous night again, leaving out, of course, the parts that already included Gato. As he told the story, Gato's expression began to harden, and he sat further back into the chair. When Ben finished, he hung his head. I am ashamed, amigo, he said. Ben looked taken aback. What? But why? Gato looked up, his brows furrowed. When you need me most, I am a coward. How do you figure that? Ben asked. You covered for me on Saturday. If not for you, I'd be in jail or the nut house. Gato just hung his head again and shrugged. What exactly did you see that night? Ronnie ventured. Gato looked at Ronnie, his eyes almost pleading for a moment before he visibly steeled himself. I could not help. I could not get up to stop the hijo de puta. He cut himself off again. Lo siento. I could not stop the bad man from what he did. The small man, he hold Toro. Ben twist his arm. When he landed on the ground. The big man, he was all of a sudden gone. I look up, and little man gone also. And someone hitting bad man over and over with a club. I look over, and little man and big man both laying on the ground. Very much blood. I go to see who is beating bad man. And Gato paused and swallowed hard. It was Ben, but it was not Ben. And the club, it was little man's arm. Hang on, Ronnie interrupted. We're gonna circle back around to that last part, but there's something I'm missing. How did both of the other 2 end up lying on the ground next to you when one was holding Ben and the other was sitting on top of you? I think the not Ben throw him. So you're telling me that Ben... Not exactly Ben, Ben chimed in, apparently unwilling to accept full culpability. Not exactly Ben, Ronnie admitted. Tore a guy's arm off and threw him so hard he knocked the other one off of you? Gato nodded. And he then proceeded to beat the last one with the severed... Torn off, Ben supplied dazedly. Torn off arm? Ronnie finished. Gato nodded again. Well, that was the 3rd theory down the drain. She had thought DID might have been a possibility, but it sure didn't explain that part. Neither did adrenaline, however much it might allow someone to do incredible things. Ben and Gato both looked a little green. He didn't hurt you, though. Ronnie made the statement rather than the question. She hoped making the point might make them both feel a little better. It didn't seem to. No, Gato admitted. He stopped hitting the bad man and turned to look at me. Dios mío, los ojos. Gato shakily crossed himself, took a breath, and continued. He looked at me and ran away into the vineyard. Ronnie frowned. But Nana said the police found them in a car at the bottom of a cliff. You got them there yourself? Gato looked suddenly guarded and glanced at Ben, who nodded. Some others help. They do not want trouble here. Ronnie nodded in understanding. There's something that I don't understand, Ben stated. Join the club, Ronnie muttered. Ben tilted his head in acknowledgement, but continued to Gato. When did you have time to bury Scruff? Bury him? Ben had left that part out. Gato looked confused as well. Bury Perito? I did not do that. There's definitely a grave out there, Ben pointed out the window. It even has a cross made out of vines. You didn't do it? Gato shook his head. Ben's eyes got wide. So that means... Ronnie agreed. The only other possibility was that Scruff was buried by blacked-out Ben. So, she said thoughtfully, the not Ben brutally dismembers and kills 3 guys, then not only leaves you unharmed, Gato, but takes Scruff and buries him with a cross. She trailed off. This just got weirder and weirder. Gato stood suddenly and handed his cup to Ben. Gracias por café, Toro. Necesito trabajar. His uneasiness apparently causing him to revert back fully to his native language and clearly indicating his unwillingness to continue on the subject. Ronnie didn't blame him. They all had a lot to think about. Ronnie and Ben stood with him. No, thank you. You literally saved my life, Ben said. He stepped forward and threw his arms around the rangy vineyard foreman. This was the man who, by all accounts, could perform superhuman feats of vengeance, who was responsible for the brutal deaths of at least 6 very bad people. And there he stood, unabashedly hugging his friend. Gato looked taken aback a moment, his arms held out to his sides. He almost immediately relaxed, his eyes softening, and patted Ben awkwardly on the back. También, my friend, and I will be a coward no longer. El hermano otro, he may find you still. If you need help. He backed away and patted the cell phone case on his belt. Call me. I will. Thanks again. And for bringing my bike. Gato nodded and flashed his crooked cat-like grin. Then he ducked through the door of the small hut. Ronnie let out a breath. So, what are you gonna do now? Ben shrugged. Getting you over to see what you thought was kind of the extent of my plan. Besides that, I need to get ready to meet Steve. He's going to call me later with a time we can meet up. Ronnie looked at him incredulously. You're still going out with your brother tonight? With everything that's going on? And what about your shift at work? I called into work right before I called you, he replied. Told him I was sick. He frowned a moment, as if considering it for the first time. The manager was pretty understanding, actually. He encouraged me to take as much time as I needed to feel better. He shrugged. As for the other thing, there's not much more I can do about it right now, unless you have any ideas. And Steve actually getting time off is more rare than a Sasquatch sighting. Do you want to come? I'd love to introduce you, and I'm sure we'd have a blast. Ronnie smiled at her friend and shook her head. Thanks, Boog. But I'm going to do some research tonight. Something about all this seems really familiar, and I need to find out what it is. So, a big thank you to anyone who has listened to my meager contribution to the greater collective of YouTube. And thanks even more to anyone who listens all the way through. And as always, if you like this story, make sure to slap a paw on the like and subscribe button. And hopefully, we'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care, be good, and bear up.